Hello everyone and welcome back to Vibe with Humanities. Today we are diving into one of the most dramatic events in world history, the French Revolution. This is part 1 of the chapter, and in this video we will talk about how French society was structured before the revolution, what caused the outbreak of the revolution, and finally how France abolished its monarchy and became a republic. The French Revolution began in 1789, and it was not just a turning point for France but for the entire world. It introduced the powerful ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The revolution ended centuries of monarchy in France and inspired future democratic movements everywhere. But before we understand how this happened, let's first look at how society in France was organized at that time. So let's travel back to 18th century France. The three estates. French society was divided into three estates. The first estate was the clergy, priests, bishops, and other church officials. They were wealthy, owned vast lands, and collected taxes called tithes. Importantly, they did not pay state taxes. The second estate was the nobility, lords, and aristocrats. They enjoyed privileges by birth, owned large estates, and lived in luxury. Like the clergy, they were also exempted from taxes. The third estate was the rest of the population, peasants, artisans, workers, and the middle class. They made up almost 90% of France, but they carried the entire tax burden. This unfair system created anger and resentment. The clergy and the nobility enjoyed countless privileges. They had special hunting rights, controlled large tracts of land, and collected money from peasants in the form of feudal dues or church taxes. And remember, they paid no taxes to the state. Their lives were full of luxury, while the majority of people struggled for basic survival. This inequality was one of the root causes of the revolution. Now imagine life as a member of the third estate. If you were a peasant or a worker, you worked long hours but earned little. Whatever you earned, most of it was spent paying taxes to the state, to the church, and to feudal lords. You had no privileges, no political voice, and yet carried the entire financial burden of France. This injustice created deep frustration. But within the third estate, a new group began to grow, the middle class. These were merchants, lawyers, teachers, and doctors. They were educated, wealthy, and inspired by Enlightenment philosophers. Thinkers like Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Locke questioned inequality and spoke about freedom, democracy, and natural rights. The middle class soon became the leaders of revolutionary change. By the late 1780s, France was facing a serious economic crisis. The treasury was empty after years of wars, including France's costly involvement in the American War of Independence. At the same time, the royal court continued to spend recklessly on luxuries. To solve the crisis, the government increased taxes, but only on the already overburdened third estate. This deepened public anger. King Louis XVI and his queen Marie Antoinette lived in the grand palace of Versailles. They spent huge amounts on parties, clothes, and jewelries, completely ignoring the struggles of their people. Instead of reducing expenses, the king tried to raise taxes, which only worsened the situation. The gap between the rulers and the ruled kept growing. The crisis wasn't just about money, it was also about food. Bread, which was the staple diet of the French people, became too expensive due to poor harvest and rising prices. Families starved, mothers stood in long queues for bread, and anger spread like wildfire. This hunger turned into revolutionary energy. In May 1789, the king called a meeting of the Estates General, a kind of representative assembly. But there was a problem. Each estate had just one vote. That meant The clergy and nobility, though only 10% of the population, could always outvote the Third Estate. The Third Estate demanded that votes be counted by head to ensure fairness, but the king refused. This triggered a historic protest. Frustrated, the representatives of the Third Estate walked out of the meeting. They declared themselves the National Assembly, saying they were the true representatives of the people of France. This was the first direct challenge to the king's authority, and it marked the beginning of a new era. Locked out of their meeting hall, the National Assembly gathered in an indoor tennis court. Here, they took the famous tennis court oath, promising not to separate until they had written a new constitution for France. This moment showed unity and determination. The revolution had found its voice. Then came the event that shook the nation. On 14 July 1789, angry crowds in Paris stormed the Bastille prison, which was seen as a symbol of the king's absolute power. The people freed prisoners, seized weapons, and destroyed the Bastille brick by brick. This event marked the official beginning of the French Revolution and is still celebrated as France's National Day. 2 years later, in 1791, the National Assembly completed France's first written constitution. This constitution reduced the king's powers and introduced the principle of separation of powers, dividing the government into the executive, legislature, and judiciary. France became a constitutional monarchy. The king was still there, but with limited authority. But the people were not satisfied with just limiting the king. On 10 August 1792, revolutionaries attacked the king's palace in Paris. Louis XVI was captured, imprisoned, and the monarchy was officially suspended. This was a turning point. France was on its way to becoming a republic. In September 1792, the National Convention declared France a republic. This meant there would be no king at all. Instead, elected representatives would rule the country. For the first time, ordinary people had a real say in governance. During this time, the Jacobins emerged as the most powerful political group. Led by Robespierre, they represented common people like small shopkeepers, artisans, and workers. The Jacobins believed in radical change, equality, and the complete removal of privileges. They pushed the revolution further and demanded the trial of the king. In 1793, King Louis XVI was put on trial for treason. He was found guilty and executed publicly by the guillotine. Soon after, Queen Marie Antoinette was also executed. Their deaths shocked monarchies across Europe, who feared that the revolution might spread to their countries as well. Let's quickly summarize what we have learned in part 1. French society was divided into 3 unequal estates. The clergy and nobility enjoyed privileges, while the Third Estate bore the burden. Economic crisis, high taxes, and food shortages led to anger. The Third Estate formed the National Assembly, took the tennis court oath, and stormed the Bastille. In 1791, France became a constitutional monarchy, but soon after, monarchy was abolished. By 1793, the king and queen were executed and France became a republic. This was only the beginning of the revolution. And that brings us to the end of part 1 of the French Revolution. In part 2, we will explore the dramatic reign of terror, the role of Robespierre, and eventually the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. If you found this video helpful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Vibe with Humanities for more such content. Thank you for watching and see you in the next one.